History as it happens, December 12, 2023. Ordinary men, extraordinary crimes.
Wenn Sowjet zeigen, oder wo sie hertragen, und wir werden in unserem Zeichen wieder siegen.
The chief perpetrators of the Holocaust were Hitler and his Nazi henchmen. Plumbers, shoemakers, or bakers probably don't come to mind. But such ordinary men became mass murderers in the service of Hitler's Reich. Their stories are the subject of a new documentary on Netflix that forces us once more to confront the problem of genocide, humans' capacity for cruelty, at a time when civilians are dying in appalling numbers in wars across the world. That's next as we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
We ask this court to affirm by international penal action man's right to live in peace and dignity.
Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Penn's rules or code of conduct? Yes or no?
I don't think they considered their murderous activities as ordinary or normal law enforcement activities. They knew very well that this was not what law enforcement typically does. Yeah? But the war, the fact that Germany fought a war, so the military confrontation, did matter insofar as even these ordinary perpetrators, those who were not fanatics, they could tell themselves, well, Germany indeed is in a lethal war with Soviet Union, with the rest of the world, and so on. Even if they had doubts about the Nazi propaganda told them, the Jews are lethal enemies of Germany. If we don't kill them, they will kill us.
It might be remembered as a defining moment of 2023, and not in a good way, when Republican Congresswoman Elise Stefanik questioned University of Pennsylvania President Liz Magill about anti-Semitism on college campuses. Magill answered in such a way that led to immediate calls for her resignation. And Harvard President Claudine Gay received the same treatment during that hearing.
Ms. Magill, at Penn, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Penn's rules or code of conduct? Yes or no?
If the speech turns into conduct, it can be harassment. Yes.
I am asking specifically calling for the genocide of Jews. Does that constitute bullying or harassment?
If it is directed and severe or pervasive, it is harassment.
So the answer is yes.
It is a context-dependent decision, Congresswoman.
It's a context-dependent decision. That's your testimony today. Calling for the genocide of Jews is depending upon the context. That is not bullying or harassment. This is the easiest question to answer yes, Ms. Magill. So is your testimony that you will not answer yes?
If it if the
yes
speech
or
becomes
no?
if the speech becomes conduct, it can be harassment, yes.
Conduct meaning committing the act of genocide? The speech is not harassment? This is unacceptable, Ms. Magill. I'm going to give you one more opportunity for the world to see your answer. Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Penn's code of conduct when it comes to bullying and harassment? Yes or no?
Harvard President Claudine Gay received the same treatment during that hearing.
Dr. Gay, a Harvard student calling for the mass murder of African Americans is not protected free speech at Harvard, correct?
Our commitment to free speech...
It's a yes or no question. Is that corrected? Is that okay for students to call for the mass murder of African Americans at Harvard? Is that protected free speech?
Our commitment to free speech
It's a yes or no
extends...
question. Let me ask you this. You are president of Harvard, so I assume you're familiar with the term intifada, correct?
I've heard that term, yes.
And you understand that the use of the term intifada in the context of the Israeli-Arab conflict is indeed a call for violent armed resistance against the state of Israel, including violence against civilians and the genocide of Jews. Are you aware of that?
That type of hateful speech is personally abhorrent to me.
And there have been multiple marches at Harvard with students chanting, quote, there is only one solution, intifada revolution, and, quote, globalize the intifada. Is that correct?
I've heard that thoughtless, reckless, and hateful language on our campus.
Well, as you can tell from listening to those exchanges, groups of neo-Nazis aren't marauding around Penn or Harvard chanting, kill the Jews. Some pro-Palestinian students enraged by Israel's war in Gaza have held demonstrations calling for, among other things, intifada, which is not necessarily a call for genocide. Intifada is an Arabic word for uprising. While it's certainly true that in the second intifada of 2000 to 2005, Palestinian suicide bombers murdered Israeli civilians, people chanting for intifada today might argue Palestinians have a right to resist Israel's military occupation of the West Bank, for instance. They might also point to history and how in 1946, the Jewish terrorist group Irgun blew up a wing of the King David Hotel as an act of violent resistance against the British occupation of Palestine. In other words, this issue is not as simple as Congresswoman Stefanik and other bad faith actors made it out to be. It involves terms that are open to interpretation, like intifada, and protected political speech, however much you might disagree with what some protesters are saying. Context matters, and always does. The Hamas terrorist attack on October 7th and Israel's war in Gaza have reignited the debate over genocide, war crimes, and the meaning of history. Hamas has been compared to the Nazis. Pro-Palestine protesters and some scholars say Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. If you spend any time on social media, you can't miss this stuff. But serious scholars, not just politicians or activists, are engaging in this debate. About 24 historians wrote an open letter to the New York Review of Books, arguing that appealing to the memory of the Holocaust obscures our understanding of the anti-Semitism Jews face today and dangerously misrepresents the causes of violence in Israel and Palestine. Now, that letter provoked a response from a different group of scholars who penned their own letter to the New York Review, saying on October 7th, Hamas carried out in Israel a deliberate campaign of mass murder, rape, torture, and kidnapping. This was not the Holocaust, they say, but it was the most important mass murder of Jews since the Holocaust. Finding commonalities and differences between historical events has always been essential to understanding the past and present. All of this forces us to sharpen our thinking about the meaning of words like genocide. Words that are used and abused in the political and activist arena. Words that are often used in campus demonstrations. At least this is what I'm thinking about after watching the Netflix documentary Ordinary Men.
German policemen in the occupied East, 1942. They're here to enforce German rule in the conquered territories. They have a special assignment: to shoot Jews by the hundreds and thousands.
The documentary is based on a book of the same title, first published in 1992 by historian Christopher Browning, about Reserve Police Battalion 101, which was sent to the Eastern Front in 1942 to murder Jews, under the authority of the SS Einsatzgruppen. During the Nuremberg trials, prosecutor Benjamin Ferencz delivered the opening argument in Einsatzgruppen Case Number 9, the audio from the Robert H. Jackson Center.
This was the tragic fulfillment of a program of intolerance and arrogance. Vengeance is not our goal, nor do we seek merely a just retribution. We ask this court to affirm by international penal action man's right to live in peace and dignity, regardless of his race or creed. The case we present is a plea of humanity to law. We shall establish, beyond the realm of doubt, facts which, before the dark decade of the Third Reich, would have seemed incredible.
Benjamin Ferencz appears in the Netflix documentary Ordinary Men. He died just a few months ago at the age of 103. And something he dedicated his life to understanding does apply to today's conflict, even if we're not dealing with Nazis. And that is dehumanizing the other. What's possible when we see others as less than human and therefore less worthy of life. As Browning wrote on page 159 of his book, Why did most men in Reserve Police Battalion 101 become killers, while only a minority of perhaps 10%, and certainly no more than 20%, did not? A number of explanations have been invoked in the past to explain such behavior: wartime brutalization, racism, segmentation and routinization of the task, special selection of the perpetrators, careerism, obedience to orders, deference to authority, ideological indoctrination, and conformity. These factors are applicable in varying degrees, but none without qualification. Wars have invariably been accompanied by atrocities. As John Dower has noted in his remarkable book, War Without Mercy, war hates induce war crimes. Above all, when deeply embedded negative racial stereotypes are added to the brutalization inherent in sending armed men to kill one another on a massive scale, the fragile tissue of war conventions and rules of combat is even more frequently and viciously broken on all sides. Hence, the difference between more conventional war, between Germany and the Western Allies, for example, and the race wars of the recent past. And again, that is historian Christopher Browning writing in the book Ordinary Men. And he was one of the scholars who wrote to the New York Review of Books, arguing against making comparisons between today's war in the Middle East and the Holocaust. So I recommend you watch the documentary on Netflix, but be warned, it is disturbing. But study the Holocaust we must. Historian Thomas Kuehne is the director of the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University. He is the author of Belonging and Genocide, Hitler's Community, 1918 to 1945. Thomas Kuehne, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Martin. I'm honored and glad to be here with you.
Well, the honor is mine. Christopher Browning said you'd be a great guest to discuss this subject, so here we go. So whenever I see a new book, a new documentary about this issue, sometimes I say, really, another one? I mean, what can we learn at this point? But I quickly realize that, yes, we have to keep studying the Holocaust and the Third Reich. There is always something new to learn here. To apply to what's going on today, I mean, we're watching a debate over whether there's a genocide occurring in the Middle East right now. Why don't we start there?
As a Holocaust historian, I couldn't agree more. Human beings, can commit the worst possible evil, can commit atrocities, and sometimes, as it seems, even enjoy themselves doing so. That is a very frightening experience, of a frightening sight. We need to explain it. I mean, we probably can't easily prevent it, but the only way to maybe get a hand on it is by explaining and maybe understanding it.
And when you say human beings are capable, we often think of the foaming at the mouth ideologue, but we're talking about ordinary people here in certain contexts. I don't think somebody just walking down the street going to work during the day in a non-war setting is capable of becoming a murderer. But in certain contexts, right, with the conditioning from the state and propaganda and in a war, really that's what we're getting at here, right?
That is true. But as we are talking about this documentary, Ordinary Men, which, as you know, is based on a path-breaking book by the preeminent Holocaust historian Christopher Browning, and when we try to relate these ordinary men to what we see now in the Middle East, then we have to be aware of the huge differences between these different types of people. It would not be helpful to conflate these different types of people. On the one hand, we indeed have ordinary men, and so that's the title of the documentary and the title of this famous book of Christopher Browning. And he chose that title for good reasons, because what they did, shooting Jews, is certainly not what ordinary men do. So ordinary men on the one hand, and Hamas fighters on the other hand today, that's not the same type of people.
No two sets of circumstances are the same. And we could also apply this question, and we will in the conversation, to how the citizenry who are not even involved in what is happening, right? Civilians see what is happening, how they process that, how they justify that, how they talk about their own government's behavior versus that of the enemy that has perpetrated an atrocity against them. We'll get to that. What did you think of this 1-hour documentary, Ordinary Men, on Netflix?
So I have to say I liked it a lot, as far as you can like the subject. That obviously is not something to like. But I think this documentary did a very good job in visualizing or transferring into a movie documentary complex insights Christopher Browning offers in his famous book. I will actually use this documentary in my class because I think it covers the historic complexity very well.
So one of the themes in the documentary is that there was a forgotten aspect to the Holocaust, and my radar goes up whenever I see a book or a documentary talking about something that's been forgotten. It's often used to, to sell the product, but maybe it's true in this case. The Holocaust by bullets. So what was the forgotten Holocaust?
Yeah, I have to say, as much as I like this documentary, this title, Holocaust by Bullets as Forgotten Holocaust, that's maybe a little exaggerated or misleading. What it relates to is the fact that the Holocaust did not include only the murdering, the killing of, very roughly spoken, 3 million Jews in the so-called death camps. That is a part of the Holocaust that is most famous or infamous and often addressed as industrialized killing. Apart from that, Germans and also a few what we call local collaborators, non-German Europeans, contributed to mass shoot Jews, especially from 1941 on. And these mass shootings are addressed as the Holocaust by bullets. Now, these mass shootings were carried out by different units, different people, mostly German, with no doubt, mostly German. The lead was taken by what we call SS-Einsatzgruppen or SS mobile killing units or task forces. They were never forgotten. They were subject of the Nuremberg trials already. They showed up in very famous, powerful Holocaust TV miniseries of 1978, and so on and so forth. So the mass shootings were never forgotten. What was forgotten for a long time, until the book of Christopher Browning in 1992, was that not only the SS did these mass shootings, but also German police officers who, unlike the SS, were not Nazi fanatics. Now, the SS was a voluntary group. You would not draft it into the SS except for the end of the war. But the SS-Einsatzgruppen was comprised of people who more or less voluntarily, whereas the police officers, German police officers that are subject of the documentarian, were forced into that units. Yeah, that's an entirely different thing. And these are actually ordinary men, unlike the SS.
2 million of the Holocaust victims were killed in these face-to-face killings, the Holocaust by bullets. You mentioned the Einsatzgruppen, the SS. Sometimes the documentary, maybe I need to see it a second time. I thought by bouncing around between 1942 and 1939, you're not always quite clear who they're talking about because, yes, the hardened SS murderers were not ordinary men. They were radicalized ideologues. But when it comes to Reserve Police Battalion 101, they were from Hamburg, right? 1942, and they were police. We assume that when you're a policeman, you're there to arrest bank robbers or whatever, not shoot innocent people in the back of the head. And one myth the documentary aims to puncture is that these killing units were under penalty of death to fulfill their orders. That if they didn't go ahead and kill Jews, they themselves would have been shot or severely punished. What can you say about that myth? What are its origins, and what is the truth?
This myth came up right after the war, already during the Nuremberg trials. The Nuremberg trials, as is known, put on trial major Nazi criminals, men and a few women who were at that time accused of being responsible for the crimes against humanity and war crimes and so on and so forth. These mostly men, again, very few women, mostly men, saw a chance of escaping justice by claiming that they simply followed orders when they committed these crimes. And so orders by whom? Well, orders by Himmler, Hitler, or alike. By individuals who at that time, late 1940s or mid-1940s, were dead. Yeah. So that was very convenient. When these men were on trial, they would say, well, I didn't want to do it. I had to. This was a dictatorship, and we operated in a military organization or paramilitary organization, and everyone knows and knew in their time that soldiers are supposed to follow orders. They're not supposed, they actually have to follow orders. So that was a very convenient excuse. Now, the problem is with that excuse, number one, those people, those very few individuals, Hitler, Himmler, and so on, the top elite of the Nazis, could no longer be put on trial because they had committed suicide, most of them, or were otherwise dead. Justices, prosecutors, and so on and so forth, when they investigated these crimes, they relatively quickly realized that actually there were quite a lot of examples of Germans who did not obey these orders, who produced excuses. I can't do that, and so on and so forth. Yeah, and these opposers or resistors, whatever you want to call them, they actually got away during the Nazi dictatorship, under the Nazi dictatorship, without any severe punishment. That made clear that people under the Nazi dictatorship, and even in military or paramilitary organizations like the SS or the police units, did have choices. Yeah? They could not obey such an order. That is what we have established after 1945. Historians, justices, and lawyers, and so on, have established this knowledge that Germans in these units did have choices. And Christopher Browning's book and the documentary illuminates the choices people had.
And it shows how the other policemen would then shame them, right? Because they were given tasks like cleaning toilets, doing awful things. And the others who went ahead and perpetrated the shootings would call the resistors cowards, sissies, what have you. So what was the purpose of shaming those who didn't want to participate in what was the Holocaust?
Well, this kind of shaming did establish a hierarchy. Yeah? In these units, there were the eager beavers, the fanatics, so to speak, who had no problems murdering Jews because they thought that's good for their career within the SS or the police, or because they were just convinced anti-Semites and bought into the Nazi propaganda about Jews and so on. Yeah, for whatever reason, so that we have these the eager beavers, the fanatics or the radicals, and then we have another group of people, especially in police units, that thought, well, I have to follow that order because otherwise I get any disadvantages and so on. And so they conformed, yeah. And then there were those relatively few individuals that resisted obeying these orders, and they found themselves at the bottom of an informal hierarchy. Yeah, they were the underdogs. That is not an unusual phenomenon in many groups. Yeah, I mean, we have hazing rituals at universities, and those people who do not participate actively in the hazing, in the active hazing, they are shamed, yeah, you coward, and so on and so forth, yeah. That meant something. You have to consider that these units operated hundreds, sometimes 1,000 miles away from home with no other choice or option of socializing, yeah. Students on a college campus can choose their friends, yeah. They can go somewhere else when they are ridiculed or so. That's a setting in any civilian society. But the policemen operating far away from home and far away from any other option of socializing, they needed to somehow get along with their comrades. And so this kind of punishment was a severe one. But these men, the resistors, made a choice. They accepted this being socially ousted or, excluded. They accepted that because they realized, or they decided they did not want to commit murder.
So what was really unsettling, even depressing about those who went ahead and complied with these orders was they got used to it and the killing became easier as it went along. They didn't grow resistant to it. So at first, many of them got sick, right? They vomited. They were disgusted with themselves. They drank heavily at night to try to wash away the memories of killing people, and not necessarily strangers either. There was a moment in the documentary where, and again, I mentioned how these people were from Hamburg, Reserve Battalion 101, where one of the soldiers, or policemen, right? Not a soldier, a policeman, recognized a cinema owner from back in Hamburg, a movie theater owner. And they walked together in the woods toward the killing zone. And the victim, A Jewish person obviously knew what was going to happen to him or her, and the policeman knew what he was going to do to this person, right? So it wasn't impersonal all the time. Back to my point about how it became easier for them to do as the mountain of corpses grew larger and larger. How do you explain that?
Yeah, that's a common phenomenon that is not a peculiarity of these police units. We can sadly observe that in many genocidal settings, in many groups of killers, even in normal criminals, gangs and so on, you kill once and then every other following killing is much easier. That's we call that routinization or brutalization or so of people. That's a phenomenon which we observe in many other settings. So that's not a peculiarity of these police units. They have moved beyond a threshold, a moral threshold once, and they knew, now I am a murderer. So, I will still be a murderer if I kill another 10 or 1,000 people. With these units, police units under Nazi rule on the one hand, and even with SS units, sometimes the opposite happened. Individual members of these groups did participate in the killing, and at some points broke apart and realized and said, well, I have done it, but I can't do it any longer. And interestingly, with these men, then did not suffer from being ousted like the initial refusers. There was this strange mindset that they had done their duty to the Nazi cause, murdering Jews, and now they had kind of the right to step aside and ask for a different assignment.
And also you hear justifications start to creep in. Don't blame me. As you said, I'm just following orders. We're stuck with a lousy job that somebody has to do. And we're here for a reason. Our state, our government, our country has sent us here. So almost like an obligation, but also a self-pitying mechanism comes in. We're the ones stuck with this lousy job.
Christopher Browning, if I remember correctly, in the documentary Ordinary Men, addresses that as double victimization. These men, especially those we would not count as fanatics or eager beavers, but who saw themselves forced into this maelstrom or vortex of violence, they indeed right away felt victimized. Why do I have to do this? Why I have to do this nasty job? Why do I have to become a murderer and so on? So they've considered themselves as victims of this command structure. And that already for them was offered a way of morally justifying what they did. So I don't want to do that. I'm just a victim of the command structure, and I have to do it against my will. Later on, they would then claim that they had only followed orders, and for that then being put on trial, they felt victimized a second time by being put on trial and convicted.
Not much sympathy for the actual victims, huh?
Correct, exactly. That's the difference.
So who were these men of Reserve Police Battalion 101? I mentioned Hamburg and 1942. They're told they're going to secure occupied areas, like a policeman might. They're not told, hey, we're going to send you out into the woods to shoot Jews in the back of the head at first. They're only told that when they arrive. They were what? Bakers, craftsmen, ordinary workers? Tell us a little bit about who they were.
Most of them were actually not even members of the Nazi Party. Some of them had been, before the Nazis took over in 1933, members of the Social Democratic Party or of liberal parties or so. So they had a non or even maybe anti-Nazi political background. They were civilians, businessmen, workers, whatever. They were relatively old, so typically in their 40s. That means they were too old, or considered being too old, for being drafted into the regular army, the Wehrmacht, the fighting army. Yeah. And the Nazi state wanted to utilize them anyway, and in a way they needed to pursue their cause.
Were they anti-Semites, or do we not know that?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question. I mean, it's very difficult to establish how anti-Semitic these men were. We may assume that a significant number of them were not what we would consider anti-Semites, especially not those that actually then stepped aside and said, no, I won't do this. And then there's a large group in the middle who just conformed. And it's difficult to say to which degree and in which ways they were anti-Semites. But we have to be aware that anti-Semitism, so the idea that Jews are somehow different than other people, Germans or other Gentiles, other Europeans, Poles, Catholic Poles or whatever, the Jews are somehow different and cause a problem. That kind of anti-Semitism was widespread in Nazi Germany. It was widespread in German and other European societies already before the Nazis came into power or occupied Poland and other parts of Europe. This type of anti-Semitism was, endorsed and multiplied by Nazi propaganda. So what we know from anecdotal evidence, we don't have any statistics on that, no opinion polls whatsoever, but anecdotal evidence suggests that even those parts of the German society that were formerly liberal or Catholic or social democrat, that even those parts of the German society were open to this type of anti-Semitism. And that matters a lot because even this large group that did not want to become murderers, they could calm down themselves about what they were doing, murdering Jews, by saying, well, probably it's the own fault of the Jews. They are just different and maybe there's something wrong with them anyway. We don't know exactly what is wrong with them, but this sense of, we call that othering, that you create a group that are them versus us, that was very common in Nazi Germany, even among so-called ordinary people.
And if your government has taken the time and effort and energy to put you in the police, give you a uniform, food, weapons, transport you, hundreds or thousands of miles away from home, and giving you this task, maybe you're saying, well, there may be a good reason for it. It's perverse, of course, but we're trying to figure out why people became murderers, because it's easy to sit here and talk about the Nazis. We understand why top Nazis and committed ideologues were doing this. Our point here today is understanding the ordinary people and what that means for our society, not just for the perpetrators, but for those of us who are watching this happen. So they were operating in a genocidal logic. But did they believe they were operating in that type of logic, or was it a law enforcement logic or a military logic?
The concept of genocide was not common at that time anyway, as we know. But I mean, there were similar concepts. Völkermord in German, that's basically the same what the concept of genocide means. So it is important to understand these ordinary men, at least many of them, did have a sense that what they committed, what they did, or were part of, murdering Jews, thousands of Jews, thousands, not one or two, thousands, that this was unprecedented. They had a sense that they committed a crime. We have the Nazis, the fanatic Nazis, who also knew that, that this was very new and unprecedented. They would think, well, it's good that I'm doing that because I have to do it. It serves a good cause, What I want to say here is that people at that time did have a sense of what they were part of, what later was called genocide. We know that from many, many sources. Germans talked even at home. The civilians learned about these mass shootings by rumor and gossip and so on. And they realized, well, what is going on here, that will be forever a huge burden for the German people.
I didn't pose my question well. You're right. Germans understood that the Jews were being killed en masse, even if they didn't know the entire scope of it all until after the war. I guess what I'm trying to get at is, did the ordinary men feel like this was part of the war effort? I mean, they weren't fighting the Russians. They weren't going up against enemy tanks or anything like that. And if we were to connect that to today, where some people see what Hamas did on 10/7 as part of a national resistance movement, where others are saying, this wasn't resistance, had no military logic whatsoever. What Hamas did was part of their genocidal aim of killing Jews, that this was terrorism as a tactic. See what I'm getting at?
On an individual level, you certainly find perpetrators of the Holocaust and Hamas fighters who seem to be similar on an individual level. But we should be very much aware that the settings are very different. And I'm not an expert on the Hamas, I have to admit. They are religiously motivated fanatics, and in so far comparable only remotely even to the Nazi fanatics at that time. If I may go back to the ordinary man and to your initial questions, how do these people consider their murderous job, and that they conceived of it as job, as work. The military setting, the fact that Germany fought a war, did matter. That is no doubt. I don't think they considered their murderous activities as ordinary or normal law enforcement activities. They knew very well that this was not what law enforcement typically does. Yeah? But the war, the fact that Germany fought a war, so the military confrontation, did matter insofar as even these ordinary perpetrators, those who were not fanatics, yeah, they could tell themselves, well, Germany indeed is in a lethal war with Soviet Union, with the rest of the world, and so on. Even if they had doubts about the Nazi propaganda told them, the Jews are lethal enemies of Germany. If we don't kill them, they will kill us sooner or later. Yeah? That's the essence of Nazi anti-Semitism. Even if they doubted that, I mean, you have to consider that these people did not have any solid other source of information. That just has to do with the nature of a dictatorship. Yeah? There is a lot of uncertainty in the mindsets of these people. As far as we can say, many were uncertain. Maybe they might have thought, well, maybe Nazi propaganda is still right, yeah, and we have to do something about the Jews. So there's lots of uncertainty. That is what we have to take into account.
Yes, we are talking about two very different contexts here, the Holocaust and World War II, and the Arab-Israeli conflict today. And Hamas does see itself as a national liberation or national resistance movement, whereas Reserve Police Battalion 101 was nothing of the kind. So how do you feel about the uses that World War II and the Holocaust are being put to today? For instance, Israeli leaders compare Hamas to Nazis.
Yeah, see, these are the comparisons or equations that are, for an academic like me, extremely problematic because they conflate things that are just very, very different. And to a certain degree, it is understandable. I mean, you have to say that for Israel, the Hamas attack on October 7, it indeed reminded them, quite understandably, of the Holocaust. And as we also know, I mean, the Hamas Charter of 1988 expresses a clear genocidal intent. So Jews in Israel have to go. Yeah? Israel has to disappear. That's a clear message. So there is a genocidal intent.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has talked about Hamas as Nazis or Hamas as another ISIS because in Israel's military campaign to destroy Hamas, he has said, look, during World War II, when the Allies were defeating the Nazis, civilians died, and you don't complain about what the Allies were doing. This is Netanyahu's argument. He made this on Meet the Press. You don't point the finger at the Allies. You blame the Nazis for starting this.
It's like in World War II, the Allies are fighting the Nazis, okay? Chancellor Kohl of Germany said that Hamas are the new Nazis. So imagine now, the Allies are fighting the Nazis. They've invaded France after they were attacked by the Nazis. They go into the cities of Germany. Obviously, the Nazis are fighting within civilian quarters, and civilians get killed. In fact, many of them were killed. Millions were killed. Now, who do you protest against? Do you protest against the Nazis, or do you protest against the Allies?
I mean, that's his way of justifying the now, 15,000 Palestinians who've been killed in Israel's campaign. But, when you start to dissect and deconstruct a lot of these statements, I think they don't withstand scrutiny.
I agree. You are right. That's just, yeah.
I answered my own question, but that's all right. Pro-Palestinian activists and even some legal scholars and historians are saying Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. I mean, what purposes do such allegations serve today? And do you agree with these allegations?
That's a very complicated question. It's very difficult. I have to say, I don't know how this ends, this conflict. Yeah. So far, I'm reluctant using the concept of genocide to what Israel currently does in Gaza. Reluctant. Maybe, I don't know how it ends. I have to stress that. I have to say, as a scholar of the Holocaust and of genocides, I have some concerns about the inflation of the use of the concept of genocide. And I have concerns about applying this concept to all kinds of violent conflicts. I think...
that's the bigger issue here.
Yeah, exactly. So There is an inflation of the use of the concept of genocide, and is now applied to all kinds of violent conflicts, often for propagandistic purposes. Yeah? Of course, I mean, colleagues of mine, scholars, who warn of a genocide committed by Israel in Gaza, they do so for good reasons. They want to prevent the radicalization. They want to remind people that they should contain the violence and so on and so forth. Yeah, these are honorable and very good reasons. Let me put it this way. I think it would be better if we analyzed and made the larger public aware of the complexity of the conflict between Israeli and Palestinians, the complexity, and raised awareness of that complexity and made people maybe understand why there is no easy fix.
What do you think of Dirk Moses's analysis that what Israel is doing here is trying to establish what he calls permanent security? So it may not be genocide, right, or ethnic cleansing or any of these other labels. Permanent security, in Dirk Moses's view, is a sinister utopian goal where, in order to prevent another attack like what happened on 10/7 from ever happening again, you resort to massive state violence, some of which may be legal. I mean, according to the international laws of war. Not all killing of civilians is necessarily a war crime under the laws of war. But what Israel is doing is trying to establish this idea of permanent security. And in the process, legal or not, thousands of civilians are dying.
I have to say, I think Dirk Moses has done, in many regards, a great job in advancing our thinking about the concept of genocide. Yeah, there are deep insights, and the concept of permanent security contributes to this thinking and rethinking of the concept of genocide. In the Israeli case, maybe some Israelis have this idea of establishing what Dirk Moses calls permanent security. But I'm not sure whether that really helps us understanding, let alone fixing, the problems in the Middle East. I mean, even if Israel succeeded to destroy Hamas, yeah, that's the official war goal now, then there would still be major parts of the Arab world who are hostile to Israel just the same way as Hamas is, and there would be no permanent security. I mean, I can't really imagine that even the most rightist or radical Israeli politicians, that they believe in such an option. I mean, how would that ever happen?
Well, I think that's the argument against what they're doing, that there's no military solution to what's happening here. Yeah. So in your work, you have stated that the German nation found itself through committing the Holocaust. What do you mean by that?
This book, Belonging in Genocide, which I published in 2010, a while ago, if you read that, it offers a more complex analysis of the relation of the German people, many different Germans, that's my point here, to the Holocaust. And what I want to say by that is that I definitely do not want to say, all or most Germans desired the Holocaust. That would be complete nonsense. It's a little more complicated insofar as Germany, before the Nazis came into power and even during the Nazi period, where Germany was a deeply divided society. We could call that the problem tribalism. Sometimes it reminds me of the American society today. Although in Germany at that time, there were not only two tribes, Democrats and Republicans, who basically no longer are able to communicate with each other, but 3 or 4 different, we call that social milieus or so. So in any case, a deeply divided society, and many Germans felt unease about that. They desired being part of a united nation. The Nazis promised to establish this united nations by overcoming class gaps, religious gaps, and so on and so forth. The Nazis did not succeed in overcoming the class gaps, and they didn't even do much effort doing so. What happened was the Nazi state, as we have discussed before, succeeded in making many Germans complicit in the murder of the Jews. Complicit, against their will or with their will or whatever. That's complicit. And what we also see is that at the end of the war, already since 1942, 1943, 1944, many Germans, you know that from diaries, letters, and other testimonies and evidence, many Germans realized even if they had not shot any single Jew, not personally contributed, let's say, even to the deportation of Jews to the death camps from Germany. Also, even then, Germans realized that they, as Germans, shared a certain level of responsibility for what we now call the Holocaust. Yeah? They realized that. Not all Germans, certainly not all Germans, but anecdotal evidence shows that many, many Germans, even non-Nazis or anti-Nazis, realized that they would be held responsible or that they were guilty at a certain level for what happened.
Because they supported the person of Hitler, even if they weren't Nazi party members or have ever voted for the Nazis. Remember, the Nazis never really won a majority in any election, but yeah, go ahead.
That is possible, exactly. Okay. They supported Hitler without supporting intentionally the Holocaust. But even if they had not supported Hitler and they realized that this mass crime, the Holocaust, and the murder of other peoples, was committed in the name of the German nation. And it was committed in the name of the German nation. So they anticipated exactly what happened in 1945, or already during that time, certainly after 1945, that the German nation as a whole was stigmatized for having carried out the Holocaust. These guilt feelings, in a very strange way, of course, united the Germans, despite divisions otherwise.
You say the desire for community and experience for belonging became the basis for mass murder.
That is what we can observe in many units, for instance, also regular army, Wehrmacht units, outside the military, outside the SS. What I want to say by that is that this desire for a large community or for smaller communities on a smaller level, that this desire made it easier for Germans to become complicit in the murder of the Jews. We have discussed the doubts most Germans had anyway. It's a complex phenomenon, so it's not a straightforward psychological process. Nonetheless, I mean, we have to be aware of these different levels of responsibility, different levels of guilt, whatever you want to call it. Yeah? There's no doubt of that. At the same time, we need to explain how a society so differentiated, like the German society in the 1930s, early 1930s, how they could eventually contribute to commit the Holocaust, the mass crime. Yeah? And in order to explain that, we have to refer to the state, a dictatorship. Yeah? Probably it wouldn't have happened without a dictatorship. But the dictatorship, so the order structure, command structure and so on, that alone doesn't explain it. And that is why I think we have to look carefully on processes of community building, of creating communities based on committing crimes. Murder in this case.
Yeah, that was your earlier point, the meaning that German society found in this atrocity.
Correct.
Yeah. Well, you say here the Nazis were able to inculcate the public to be complicit in something like this in a couple of different ways because, number one, and I'll have you explain what you mean by this, they developed a sophisticated ideology of anti-universalistic, dichotomist ethics that not only justified genocide, but required it.
Often, Nazi perpetrators or Nazis in general are, as we say, demonized. So they are considered to be monsters and sadists and so on. Like labels mean to put Nazi perpetrators, Holocaust perpetrators and so on outside of the human world. Yeah? So these are not real human beings. They are monsters and so on and so forth. That is very problematic, I think, for many reasons, among other, because the Nazis themselves, or the perpetrators, the Nazis, let's say the fanatic Nazis, SS and so on and so forth, they were convinced that they did morally good when they murdered the Jews or other people. They were convinced they did good, morally good. Yeah? Why so? Well, they were convinced that there is no universal moral. There's only a moral code that applies to the German people or the Aryan so-called race and so on, and that Jews and other groups do not belong to that world of goodness. Yeah,
their organic community is what they called it.
Exactly. Himmler, in an infamous speech, once said. That was actually a secret speech, but still he said it to his entourage and his SS men. Good is only what serves the German people. Good can never be what serves the Jewish people. Yeah? This is what I call a particularistic morality as opposed to universal moral.
No international human rights. There's a certain German nation gets to make up its own rules as to who belongs and who doesn't. The reason I'm bringing these up, and we'll wrap up here, is because when we think about these concepts and the Holocaust, it's not easy to apply them to what's going on today. It shows us that we have to be careful about making such comparisons. So we'll wrap up with this, Professor Kuehne. What you alluded to before about just dismissing these people as monsters, that they're not part of the human race. The documentary on Netflix makes a point of saying we have to drop that thinking. Metaphorically speaking, sure, they were monsters. And if you say, no, they're not monsters, it sounds like you're defending them. No, they were humans. They were people. And all of us, do you agree? All of us are capable of doing evil to others when we're conditioned to see the other as less deserving of human life.
Well, at least we all carry the potential of doing so. Yeah, we carry the potential. I mean, the case of the Police Battalion 101 shows that not all people did that. Yeah? Not all people became murderers or monsters. A solid moral frame, in some cases, may prevent the worst. But this has been said by colleagues of mine, Holocaust scholars in the documentary, that sadly, maybe not all, but most individuals potentially can become murderers if they are put into respective settings, if they are subject to indoctrination, and if they are cut off from contradictory information. That is how I would see it is.
We thank Thomas Kuehne of Clark University for his insights. And I will close by reading a couple of sentences from the very last page of historian Richard Evans' trilogy on the Third Reich. Page 764 of Volume 3. Evans writes, "The Third Reich raises in the most acute form the possibilities and consequences of the human hatred and destructiveness that exist, even if only in a small way, within all of us. It demonstrates with terrible clarity the ultimate potential consequences of racism, militarism, and authoritarianism. It shows what can happen if some people are treated as less human than others. It poses in the most extreme possible form the moral dilemmas we all face at one time or another in our lives, of conformity or resistance, action or inaction, in the particular situations with which we are confronted. This is why the Third Reich will not go away," Evans concludes, "but continues to command the attention of thinking people throughout the world long after it has passed into history." On the next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to stay with the theme of history on TV. There is a new movie on Netflix about Bayard Rustin, the civil rights leader. We'll speak to historian Will Jones about what that movie gets right and wrong and why it was a missed opportunity. That's next as we report History as It Happens, final few episodes of 2023, a podcast from the Washington Times.